Madam President, I rise today in order to ask for unanimous consent to pass S.J. Res. 63, a resolution to terminate the COVID-19 National Emergency Declaration. It's been more than 2.5 years since the national emergency concerning the novel coronavirus disease outbreak was declared. And it's been extended now twice already by President Biden since the initial proclamation, most recently in February this year. It is this declaration, coupled with other additional emergency powers currently invoked by the presidents, which this administration is using to supersize government in order to continue their reckless, inflationary spending spree and enact their radical partisan agenda. In fact, the White House uses these emergencies to justify their inflationary, out-of-control spending, their unconstitutional vaccine and mask mandates, and to forgive student loans. This is not the first time I come to the floor to terminate this emergency declaration. In fact, in March, I brought an identical resolution to this floor under the expedited procedures contained in the National Emergency Act that passed this body by a vote of 48 to 47. At that time, the status of the virus in this nation had greatly improved since the dark early days of the pandemic. Everyone ages 12 and older were eligible for a booster shot if they wanted further inoculation. Now, more than 550 million shots had been administered in the United States, with 215 million people being fully vaccinated. 2 oral antivirals have been made available for certain patients, and monoclonal antibody treatments were available for those at high risk of becoming seriously ill. Fast forward to today, 6 months later, and the status of our immunity and ability to fight the virus in the United States has improved further still. More than 616 million doses have been administered, and 225 million people are fully vaccinated, nearly 70% of the population. If you include natural immunity, immunity gained through natural infection, the CDC stated just last month that approximately 95% of Americans over the age of 16 have some acquired level of immunity. Everyone ages 12 and older can receive Omicron-specific boosters, and we have a growing roster of antiviral drugs and monoclonal antibodies that are helping vulnerable populations avoid life-threatening infections. Now, this is not the time to ignore the individuals still struggling with COVID or those that are tragically dying with the virus, but it does demonstrate that we've made major advancements in our fight against COVID-19 and are in a less dire, more endemic phase. In fact, even as President Biden recently acknowledged during a 60-minute interview that the pandemic is over. Of course, the president's handlers immediately walked back this claim to argue that the pandemic is in fact not over. But why? Why would the federal officials calling the shots in the executive branch not want to declare this pandemic over? Because it's the fear-mongering and the robust authorities provided by the emergency declaration allow this administration to justify infringing upon your rights and validates their continued expansion of inflationary government spending and social programs. It was this government-imposed state of emergency that justified their continued lockdowns of small businesses and schools. It was this government-imposed state of emergency that justified their vaccine and mask mandates that continue to this day in too many instances. It was this government-imposed state of emergency that justified President Biden and congressional Democrats' inflationary spending binge, starting with the $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan last year and their curiously and inappropriately named Inflation Reduction Act this summer. And most recently, it was the National Emergency Declaration that allowed the president to extend the payment pause and cancel up to $10,000 in outstanding federally held student loan balances and $20,000 for Pell Grant recipients. This rallying cry of the far left that the president is pandering to will cost the federal government $420 billion. $420 billion, according to the Congressional Budget Office. The Wall Street Journal called the move, and I quote, an unprecedented act of peacetime fiscal recklessness. And every American knows this is inflationary. This is exactly the problem. The Biden administration is keeping Americans under the strains of the National Emergency Declaration as if it were not living in a time of peace, as if it were living in a time of war that requires the full force of the federal government. Rights and fiscal responsibility be damned. In order to respond to this crisis, in order to rein in this massive expansion of government, to slow down inflation and restore Americans' fundamental rights, we must take the important step of terminating the COVID-19 National Emergency Declaration. I encourage all my colleagues to join me in supporting doing so. Thank you, Madam President. I ask unanimous consent that the Finance Committee be discharged from further consideration of SJ Resolution 6-3 and the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration. I further ask that the joint resolution be considered, read a third time and passed, and that the motion to reconsider be considered, made, and laid upon the table.
Is there objection?
Reserving the right to object, Madam President.
The senior senator from Oregon.
Madam President, I just went over to our colleague from Kansas and told him I would much rather be on the floor this afternoon working in a bipartisan way on something like this, and I hope that can be part of Senate proceedings in the future. Here's what I think is important for the public to know about this proposal. It is, in the real world, the Marshall proposal is a prescription for less flexibility and more red tape in American health care. And I want to be very specific. Every member of this body understands that America has a serious shortage of nurses and health care providers. Every single time we go home, I'm sure this is the case for our colleague from Kansas, a physician, hears from physicians and providers. Every time we're home, we hear from healthcare providers. I see the President of the Senate has been a very strong advocate for healthcare improvements for patients and providers. Every time we're home, we hear about the need for more healthcare providers. Now, right now, there are requirements in Medicare for a lengthy process that must be completed before it's possible to hire healthcare providers to serve Medicare patients. If the Marshall proposal goes into effect as written, Health and Human Services could not waive this complicated process to take care of patients. So that would leave our country short of healthcare providers when there's an acute, even more serious need for them. So I'm just going to close with this, because we're all hoping to be home over the next week or so. When I'm home, I always do these open to all town hall meetings. I go to every one of my counties every year. I've had more than 1,020 of them. Open to all, ask whatever you want. I have never had a constituent at home, an Oregonian, say, Ron, what we need is more complicated processes and red tape in American healthcare. Usually they're talking to us about waiving things. So for those reasons, Madam President, I object.
Objection is heard.
Madam Chair, Madam
Junior
President.
Senator from Kansas.
Yeah. Well, I certainly appreciate the chairman's comments and his sincere commitment, and we certainly share some of the same goals. Practicing medicine in rural Kansas for 25 years, we've been faced with physician shortages for decades, for nursing shortages for decades. And we both agree that that's a problem. But the difference is I don't think the government is the solution to the problem. I think the government's created the problem. That physicians and nurses are so tired of dealing with all the red tape, all the continuing burden that the ACA has put on us. I'm so proud of the doctors and nurses. When this country called for them in an emergency, we, including myself, volunteered rushing to the front lines of the emergency rooms to take care of patients. And now this Congress is going to reward them with a pay cut, by the way. But this is not the solution to the doctor shortages or the nurse shortages. The solution is to respect the profession, to remove some of the red tape, allow us to be doctors and nurses. Don't make us be tied down with issues like prior authorization, which I know your committee is seriously considering as well, and we appreciate your work on that as well. Certainly, what I do have people that come to my town halls, and like you, we've been to 100 counties in the last 2 years. We have 5 left to go. And what people ask me is why do our kids in the Head Start programs still need to wear a mask? Do they even do any good? Why are there still vaccine mask mandates out there? Why is this government continuing inflationary spending? And it's my feeling that this emergency declaration allows the President and the White House to expand those powers to take our constitutional rights away from us. You know, again, I have encouraged people to take the vaccine and do all the right things, but I still think that it's time to end the emergency, give us our God-given constitutional rights back, and think that we should support ending this declaration of emergency. Thank you, and I yield back.